All right, settle in, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink. Because for the next couple of hours, we're going on a journey. Not the kind of journey you'd choose, certainly. We're going to step back in time, far from the comforts and certainties of our modern world, and explore one of the most brutal, yet often overlooked, realities of Viking Age society. We hear a lot about the Vikings, the fierce warriors, the daring explorers, the skilled craftspeople, the complex mythology. We see the horned helmets in cartoons, which, spoiler alert, they didn't actually wear in battle, and the braided beards and the long ships cresting the waves. There's a certain romance to the image, isn't there? Freedom, adventure, strength. But that was the life of the free person in Viking society. That was the life of the Jarl, the chief, the Carl, the free farmer or craftsman. That was not the life of the vast majority of people touched by the Viking expansion, nor was it the life of a significant portion of people living within the Viking homelands. Today we're going to explore the life of someone at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy, someone who owned nothing, not even their own body, someone whose fate rested entirely in the hands of others. We are going to spend approximately 2 hours examining in detail the daily reality, the challenges, the pain, and the sheer hopelessness of being a thrall, a Viking slave. And I'm going to tell you right now why, based on the historical evidence we have from sagas, law codes, archaeology, and contemporary accounts, you wouldn't last a day as a Viking slave. We're going to peel back the layers of this forgotten existence. We'll talk about how someone became a thrall, the terrifying journey into servitude, the brutal labor, the meager existence, the lack of rights, the constant threat of violence, and the sheer, grinding monotony of a life without freedom. This won't be a story of epic battles or glorious feasts. It will be a story of dirt, sweat, cold, hunger, fear, and the quiet endurance of the utterly powerless. It's a vital piece of understanding this complex historical period and a stark reminder of how far we've come, and perhaps how easily some forms of suffering can be erased from popular memory. So, settle deeper into your chair. Let the sound wash over you. We're going back to the Viking Age. Not to the chieftain's hall, but to the damp, cold corner where the thralls slept. Let's begin. All right, let's start with the basics. What exactly was a thrall in the Viking Age? The Old Norse word was threll, pronounced roughly thra-el. And it's crucial to understand that in Viking society, which was generally divided into 3 classes according to the lay of Rig, Rigstula, the Jarl, nobility, the Carl, free people, farmers, craftsmen, and the thrall, slaves. You were, quite simply, human property. This isn't like later forms of indentured servitude, where there was a contract and an end date. This wasn't like the serfdom of medieval Europe, where a person was tied to the land, but still had some recognized rights and community ties, maybe even a small plot to work for themselves. No, a thrall was legally chattel, a possession, an item of value, yes, perhaps comparable to a good tool, a useful animal, or a piece of equipment, but ultimately owned by someone else. Think about that for a moment. Every decision about your life, your work, your food, your shelter, where you slept, who you interacted with, whether you lived or died, was not yours to make. It belonged to your owner, your bondi, free farmer owner, or jarl. Your very identity was defined by your lack of freedom. You didn't have a family in the legal sense, not one that was recognized by society or could claim you or protect you. Any children you had automatically inherited your status. They were born thralls just like you were. Law codes from places like Iceland, Norway, and Sweden are very clear on this. If you harmed a thrall, the fine was significantly less than harming a free person. In some cases, if you killed a thrall, You simply paid a fine to their owner, compensating them for the loss of their property. It wasn't considered murder in the same way killing a free person was. This wasn't just a social stigma. It was written into the legal fabric of their world. Imagine living in a society where your life was literally valued less than that of a free person's limb, where you could be bought, sold, traded, or even killed with minimal legal repercussions for the owner, where your testimony in any dispute held little to no weight, where you could not own property, could not enter into contracts, could not marry without your owner's explicit, probably self-interested, permission. This was the fundamental state of being a thrall, stripped of legal personhood, reduced to a commodity. And this status permeated every single aspect of your existence, from the moment you woke up, if you could call your brief period of unconsciousness sleeping, until the moment you finally collapse from exhaustion again. It's crucial to understand this baseline of utter powerlessness before we dive into the grim details of daily life. This wasn't just hardship, it was a complete denial of fundamental human autonomy. And for someone like you, accustomed to rights, choices, and the simple concept of owning your own body and destiny, it would be a shock so profound, so soul-crushing, that survival, even for a day, would be a monumental struggle. So how did you end up as a thrall? It wasn't usually a gradual process. For most, it was sudden, brutal, and irreversible. The most common way, the one that fueled the Viking slave trade, was capture. Imagine this. You live in, say, Anglo-Saxon England or Ireland or the Slavic lands to the east, or perhaps even on the fringes of Scandinavia itself. You're a free farmer, a villager, a monk, a craftsman. You have your small plot of land, your family, your community, your familiar routines. The sun rises, you work, you eat, you sleep. Life is hard, yes, but it is yours. Then one morning, or perhaps in the dead of night, the long ships appear. They might glide silently up a river or crash onto a beach, and the world explodes into chaos. The terrifying sound of the war horns, the guttural shouts in a language you might not understand, the clash of steel, the screams of your neighbors. Smoke begins to fill the air from burning homes and churches. You huddle, you run, you fight if you're able and armed, but against a trained, organized raiding party, resistance is often futile. They are looking for portable wealth, silver, gold, treasures, and the most valuable, most portable commodity of all, people. They are looking for you. Rough hands grab you. You are tied, perhaps with others, your wrists bound with rough rope or leather. The terror is absolute. The smell of smoke is acrid in your nostrils, mingling with the metallic tang of blood and the overwhelming odor of fear, yours and everyone else's. You see your home being looted, perhaps your family members suffering the same fate or worse. You are just one among many now, a unit of potential value, driven perhaps at sword point towards the waiting ships, stumbling over rough ground, pushed, shoved, maybe kicked if you don't move fast enough. The feeling of helplessness is total. This isn't just a bad day, this is the end of your life as you knew it. In the space of an hour, you've gone from being a person with a name and a place to a piece of human cargo. This image of the raid-captured thrall is the most famous, and for good reason. The Viking slave trade was vast, with markets stretching from Dublin in the west to the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate in the east. Millions of people were trafficked in this way over the centuries. But that wasn't the only path to becoming a thrall, even within Viking society itself. Imagine you were born to two thrall parents. Your fate was sealed from birth. No raid needed, you simply arrived in the world already owned. Your first breath was drawn as someone else's property. Perhaps you were a free person who fell into crippling debt. Without a welfare system or easy bankruptcy, defaulting on a significant debt could mean selling yourself or members of your family into temporary or even permanent servitude to repay it. A failed harvest, a sickness, a lost lawsuit, any misfortune could potentially lead to this fate. Imagine the shame, the desperation that would drive a free person to voluntarily give up their freedom. Maybe you committed a crime. Depending on the severity, a punishment could include being enslaved, often to the injured party or the community leader. Losing your freedom was a recognized legal penalty. Less common, but possible, was being given away or sold by desperate relatives during times of famine or extreme hardship. Or even, in rare instances, a free person voluntarily selling themselves into slavery, perhaps for protection or guaranteed, albeit meager, sustenance during a harsh winter or time of war, though this was risky as there was little guarantee of ever regaining freedom. So, while the raid is the dramatic image, your path to becoming a thrall could have been quieter, born into it, or a slow slide into desperation through debt or misfortune. But the end result was the same: utter loss of freedom, identity, and rights. The very foundation of your modern existence, your autonomy, would be ripped away, and that shock, the sheer psychological trauma of becoming property, would be your first immense hurdle. Okay, you've been captured or sold due to debt, or you were born into it and are now old enough to be useful. Your fate is sealed. If you were captured abroad, the next step was often a journey, and this journey was rarely a pleasant one. If you were inland, it meant forced marches, often for days or weeks, perhaps with ropes around your neck or wrists, tied to a string of other captives, stumbling over rough terrain through forests, across rivers, minimal food and water, just enough to keep you moving, exhaustion, pain, blisters, and the constant fear of being left behind, or worse, if you faltered. Imagine the sheer physical toll on a body accustomed to modern comforts and regular meals. Your feet would be raw, your muscles screaming, your throat parched. The smell of dozens, maybe hundreds, of terrified, unwashed bodies crammed together would be overwhelming. But the most iconic journeys were by sea. You, along with maybe dozens or even hundreds of other captives, would be crammed into the hold or onto the decks of a nar, a merchant ship, or perhaps even a long ship if the voyage was shorter or less focused purely on cargo. These ships were not designed for passenger comfort. They were built for carrying goods or warriors. You'd be packed in tightly, no room to lie down properly, maybe just a few feet of space to sit or curl up in. The air below deck would be thick, with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food, bilge water, and vomit. Imagine the pitching and rolling of the ship on the open sea. Most people would be violently seasick. There would be no sanitation beyond maybe a bucket, quickly overflowing and adding to the stench. Or you might be shackled, or simply packed in, so tightly you couldn't move much anyway. The rough wood of the ship scraping against your skin. The constant sound of creaking timbers, the roar of the wind, the crash of waves, and the miserable groans and retching of your fellow captives. Food would be minimal and unpleasant. Dried fish, hard biscuits, if you were lucky, maybe some sour drink. Water would be rationed. You would be constantly cold and damp from sea spray, or perhaps miserably hot and stuffy below deck, depending on the weather. There would be no privacy, no dignity. Every bodily function would be performed in front of strangers. Fear would be a constant companion. Fear of the sea, fear of the raiders who captured you, fear of what awaited you at your destination. Imagine weeks, maybe even months of this. Crossing the North Sea, sailing down rivers into Eastern Europe, heading across to Ireland or Britain, bound, sick, hungry, cold, and terrified. Your body, used to soft beds and climate control, would be in utter rebellion. Dehydration, dysentery, exposure, hypothermia, sheer exhaustion, and despair would be serious threats. Many captives wouldn't survive the journey. They would be simply thrown overboard. This journey wasn't just physical transport. It was a psychological breaking process. It reinforced your powerlessness, your reduction to a commodity. You were literally shipped goods, and for you, with your modern sensibilities about comfort, hygiene, and safety, the sheer physical and sensory assault of this voyage would likely be overwhelming. Your body would give out, or your will to endure the misery would simply evaporate. Let's say you survived the journey. You arrive at one of the major trading centres, places like Dublin, one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe, or Hedeby in Denmark, Kaupang in Norway, Birka in Sweden, or the bustling river towns of the Rus in Eastern Europe like Novgorod or Kiev. The arrival itself would be disorienting. The sounds, the smells, the sheer alienness of the place compared to wherever you came from, and then you would be taken to the market. Slave markets were common features of these trading towns. They were bustling, noisy places filled with merchants, buyers, and other goods being traded: furs, amber, weapons, silver, and people. You'd be perhaps cleaned minimally, just enough to seem presentable, but still probably dirty, gaunt, and exhausted from the journey. You'd be displayed, often stripped down, to assess your physical condition. Imagine the profound humiliation of this. Standing naked or nearly naked in a public place, surrounded by strangers who are examining you like an animal or an object. Buyers would come and look at you. They would check your muscles, your hands for calluses, indicating past work or potential for future work. Your teeth to guess your age and health, maybe your back for scars, either a sign of past punishment or resilience. They might poke, prod, make you walk, make you lift something small, all while discussing your potential value in a language you might or might not understand. The air would be thick with the smell of the market, animals, food stalls, unwashed people, maybe the tang of the nearby harbour. The noise would be a constant roar of shouting vendors, haggling buyers, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, and the cries of other captives. You'd see others like you, men, women, children, from different lands, speaking different tongues, sharing the same look of fear and despair in their eyes. Some might be weeping quietly, others standing, stoically trying to hide their terror. Buyers would be looking for specific attributes: a strong young man for heavy farm labor, a sturdy woman for household work or field labor. Children were also valuable. Skilled captives, a blacksmith, a weaver, a scholar, though intellectual. Skills were less valued than practical ones. Might fetch a higher price, but still they were just skills attached to property. You might be bought by a wealthy jarl for his estate or a moderate carl for his family farm. You might be bought by a merchant to be traded again further east or west. You might be bought alone or as part of a group. The transaction would be quick. Silver or goods would change hands, a simple transfer of ownership. And suddenly you belong to someone new, someone who now holds absolute power over your life. The buyer might be harsh or relatively less so, but you have no way of knowing. You are simply led away to your new fate. This market experience was the final severing of any remaining connection to your past life. You were a piece of merchandise, evaluated and purchased. The objectification is complete. For a modern person, the psychological impact of being treated as less than human, of being publicly displayed and sold, would be devastating. It's another layer of trauma your mind and spirit would have to somehow absorb after the capture and the journey. Could you endure the sheer indignity? So you've been bought. Let's assume you've been purchased by a reasonably prosperous farmer, a Bondi, living somewhere in Scandinavia, Iceland, or perhaps a Viking settlement like the Danelaw in England or the Norse areas of Ireland. This was the most common destination for thralls. Your new home is likely a longhouse, langhus. Forget any romantic notions of a cozy, firelit hall from movies. The longhouse was primarily functional. It was a large, rectangular building, often made of wood or turf and stone, with a thatched or turf roof. Inside, there was usually a central hearth running most of the length of the building for fire, heat, and cooking. Smoke was a constant issue. While there were smoke vents in the roof, much of it lingered, coating everything in soot and smelling strongly of wood smoke, animal dung, and unwashed bodies. The interior was usually divided. One end might be a byre for livestock, sharing body heat with the human inhabitants. The central area around the hearth was where the free family ate, socialized, and often slept on raised platforms or benches lining the walls. Your place? Not on the raised platforms. You'd likely sleep on the floor, perhaps near the entrance where it was coldest and most drafty, or in a specific, less desirable section of the house. Your bed would be a scattering of straw or rushes, maybe a rough wool blanket if you were lucky. No mattress, no pillow, no privacy screen. Just the hard, cold, damp earth floor beneath you. Imagine the feeling of that rough floor, the dampness seeping into your clothes. The straw would be itchy and probably infested with fleas and lice. The smell of smoke, animals, cooking, and dozens of unwashed human bodies crammed together in poor ventilation would be thick and constant. This wasn't a house, it was a functional shelter that prioritized keeping livestock and free people warm and dry, with you as an afterthought. Sleeping conditions would be miserable. It would be cold, even near the fire, due to drafts and poor insulation. The noise would be constant, animal sounds, snoring, coughing, maybe the murmur of the free, family talking. You'd be constantly aware of your surroundings, your vulnerability, and the fact that you were literally sleeping at the feet of your owners. Hygiene was minimal. There were no bathrooms as we know them. People would relieve themselves outside, likely in designated areas, but the smells would carry, especially in warm weather or rain. Waste from animals in the byre section added to the olfactory assault. Washing was rare and often done in cold water. Clean clothes were a luxury you wouldn't have. You'd likely have one or two rough tunics and leg coverings made of coarse wool. These would be worn constantly, becoming stained, stiff with sweat and dirt, and increasingly threadbare and itchy. Living in this environment, constantly exposed to cold, damp, poor air quality, and filth, would be a massive shock to your modern system. Your body, used to temperature control, clean sheets, daily showers, and laundry, would be in constant discomfort. You'd be perpetually dirty, itchy, and exposed to every germ circulating in that cramped, unsanitary space. The sheer physical, sensory unpleasantness of your living conditions day in and day out would be a major test of your endurance. All right, let's talk about food. Your sustenance as a thrall was purely functional, enough to keep you alive, and working, but rarely more. Forget 3 square meals a day or variety. Your diet would be monotonous, basic, and often barely sufficient. The staple would likely be grains, barley or oats, perhaps rye or wheat if available. This would be made into thick porridges or gruels, often cooked with water or sour whey, the liquid left after making cheese. Imagine eating the same bland, starchy mush, probably under-seasoned or unsalted, day after day. week after week. The texture would be heavy, the taste uniform. Root vegetables like turnips, cabbage, and leeks might be available, often added to the gruel or boiled separately. Legumes like peas and beans could also form part of the diet, providing much-needed protein, but again, prepared simply and repetitively. Meat was a luxury you wouldn't see often, if ever, on your plate. The valuable cuts went to the free family. You might get scraps, bones for soup, or perhaps intestines or other less desirable parts. Fish might be more common if the farm was near the coast or a river, but again likely the less valuable catches may be dried and salted to the point of being tough and unpleasant. Dairy products were important. Milk, often soured quickly, butter and cheese were part of the Viking diet. As a thrall, you might get whey or buttermilk more often than whole milk or cheese. Your meals would be simple, prepared in large batches. Over the open fire in the longhouse, you'd eat from simple wooden bowls or trenchers, maybe using a wooden spoon. No cutlery, no napkins, certainly no refined dining. Quantities would be just enough to prevent starvation and fuel your labor. You would likely feel perpetually hungry, or at best, only temporarily sated by a bowl of thick gruel. Hunger pangs would be a constant, gnawing companion. Imagine the taste of that repetitive, bland, and often unappetizing food. The smell of boiling grains and vegetables day after day. The feeling of emptiness in your stomach even after you've eaten. Your body, used to varied, nutrient-rich food, sugary snacks and controlled portions, would be deprived and constantly craving more. Malnutrition, or at least significant nutritional deficiencies, would be likely. Furthermore, food safety standards were non-existent by modern measures. Food storage was basic: drying, salting, fermenting. Food could easily spoil, become contaminated by insects or rodents, or simply be of poor quality. Mild food poisoning would likely be frequent, and serious cases potentially fatal, with no access to medical care. The lack of appealing food, the constant hunger, and the risk of illness from contaminated meals add another layer to the misery of being a thrall. Eating is one of life's basic comforts, a source of pleasure and nourishment. As a thrall, it would become just another reminder of your low status and precarious existence, a source of mere calories to fuel the next round of relentless labor. If you were one of the many thralls on a farm, your life would be dominated by physical labor from before sunrise until after sunset, 7 days a week, with no weekends, no holidays, and certainly no sick days. This was the engine of the Viking economy, and you were a vital, disposable part of that engine. The work was hard, repetitive, and relied on brute strength and endurance, using simple, often inefficient tools. Spring meant preparing the fields, ploughing the heavy earth, often with an ard, a simple scratch plough that didn't turn the soil, requiring cross-ploughing, pulled by oxen or horses guided by hand. Imagine the effort required to control the animal and the plough, wrestling with the tough sod. Then came sowing the seeds by hand, a painstaking process, mending fences, clearing stones, preparing new land if the farm was expanding. Summer brought weeding, tending the crops, and perhaps haymaking, cutting grass with scythes and sickles, raking it and stacking it into hayricks for winter fodder. Haymaking is incredibly demanding work, hot, sweaty, itchy, and relentless. You'd also be tending to the livestock, mucking out stalls, a constant back-breaking and smelly task, leading animals to pasture, milking if you were a female thrall, shearing sheep, cleaning wool. Autumn was harvest time, the most crucial and demanding period, cutting the grain crops with sickles, bending over for hours on end, bundling the stalks, threshing the grain, beating it to separate the kernels from the husks. Dusty, tiring work. Winnowing, using the wind or a fan to separate grain from chaff. This was a race against time and weather, requiring maximum effort from dawn till dusk, often into the night by firelight if needed. Your muscles would ache constantly, your hands would be calloused and probably cut, your back would scream in protest. Winter didn't mean rest, there was still work to be done. Tending livestock in the byre, ensuring they were fed and watered, repairing tools and buildings, cutting and hauling wood for fuel, heavy, dangerous work. Clearing snow, maybe quarrying stone. There was also indoor work, grinding grain on the quernstone, a task we'll discuss separately, spinning wool, or flax, weaving, making and mending clothes. The physical demands were immense. Your body would be in a perpetual state of fatigue and soreness. There was no access to pain relievers like ibuprofen or paracetamol, no hot baths to soak aching muscles, no comfortable bed to recover. You just had to keep going day after day. Imagine the repetitive motions, the strain on your joints, the constant exposure to the elements. Sun, rain, cold, wind, the feeling of sweat stinging your eyes in summer, the biting cold making your fingers clumsy and painful in winter. The smell of damp earth, manure, sweat and wood smoke would be your constant workplace aroma. And always the pressure from your owner. If you weren't working hard enough, if you seemed lazy or slow, punishment was swift and harsh. There was no possibility of unionizing, no minimum wage, no labor laws. Your output was directly linked to your owner's profit, and they would extract as much as possible from your body and labor. This isn't just hard work, it's relentless, physically punishing, dangerous labor in harsh conditions, with inadequate food and rest under constant supervision and the threat of violence. For a body accustomed to sitting at a desk, using power tools, or even just a standard 40-hour work week with guaranteed breaks and weekends, enduring a single day of this kind of toil day after day would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Your modern body simply isn't conditioned for it. Not all thralls work primarily in the fields or with livestock. Some, particularly women, though men and children too, were household thralls. Their labor focused on maintaining the long house and assisting the free family. While perhaps slightly less physically demanding than field work in some ways, you weren't directly exposed to the elements for 14 hours a day, it was still relentless, often monotonous, and took place under the constant, close scrutiny of the mistress of the house. One of the most iconic tasks was grinding grain. Every bit of flour used for bread or porridge had to be ground by hand using a quernstone. 2 heavy circular stones, one stationary on the bottom, one rotated by hand using a wooden handle. This was a continuous process. Grain needed grinding. Daily? Imagine standing or kneeling for hours, rotating that heavy top stone, feeling the rhythmic grind of the grain between the stones, hearing the scraping sound, your arms and shoulders aching from the repetitive motion. The dust from the grain would fill the air, coating everything, getting into your lungs. It was physically demanding and incredibly monotonous work. Spinning and weaving were also key tasks, often done by female thralls. Preparing the wool, or flax, cleaning, carding, or hackling, spinning it into thread using a drop spindle, requiring dexterity and endless repetition, and then weaving the thread into fabric on a loom. Again, this was skilled work requiring long hours and patience, sitting or standing for extended periods, feeling the rough texture of the fibers, listening to the click and whir of the spindle or the clatter of the loom. Other household tasks included tending the fire, ensuring it never went out, feeding it with wood cut and hauled by others, managing the smoke, fetching water from a well or stream, carrying heavy buckets, especially difficult in winter, cleaning, a relative concept in the long house. Surfaces might be wiped, floors might be swept with branches, but deep cleaning was not the norm. mending clothes, preparing food, washing vegetables, chopping, stirring pots over the fire, often inhaling smoke. Children who were thralls would perform age-appropriate tasks, fetching and carrying, minding younger children of the free family, helping with simple tasks like sorting grain or cleaning. While you might be indoors, you were still living and working in conditions of low hygiene, poor air quality, and constant cold or stuffiness. You were always on duty, expected to be available at your owner's beck and call. There was no downtime, no quiet corner to escape to. Your living space was also your workspace, shared with the free family and any other thralls. The lack of autonomy was just as present here as in the fields. Even simple tasks required implicit permission, or were part of a rigid routine dictated by others. The mistress of the house held significant authority over the household thralls and could be just as demanding, or even more so, than the master. Imagine the psychological toll of this constant, visible subservience combined with mind-numbingly repetitive tasks like grinding grain for hours on end. Your body aches from the physical strain, your mind is weary from the monotony, and you are constantly reminded of your status by the presence and demands of your owners. This different kind of toil might seem preferable to field work at first glance, but it brought its own unique set of burdens that would wear you down. While most thralls worked on farms, some were used for more specialized or dangerous labor, depending on the needs and wealth of the owner. These roles might offer a tiny bit more variety, but often came with increased risk or a different kind of isolation. Mining, particularly for iron ore, was incredibly difficult and dangerous. Viking Age mines were often shallow pits or adits, but the work of extracting ore, hauling it to the surface, and then potentially working the bellows for smelting furnaces was brutal. Imagine being deep underground or in cramped, smoky pits, swinging a pickaxe, hauling heavy baskets of rock and ore, breathing in dust and fumes. The risk of collapse was real, and the environment was dark, dirty, and dangerous. Thralls might also be used for quarrying stone for building. Charcoal burning was essential for smelting and smithing, but it was a hot, dirty, and potentially dangerous job, often done in forests some distance from the main farm. Building and monitoring the charcoal mounds, controlling the slow burn to produce pure carbon meant long hours in isolation, surrounded by smoke and the risk of fire. Some thralls might have been used on merchant ships, the Nars, though it's unclear how common this was compared to free crewmen. If they were, they would perform the most basic, back-breaking tasks, rowing when the wind died, handling heavy cargo, bailing water, keeping the ship clean, a relative term at sea. Conditions would be similar to the journey you might have. Taken as a captive, just ongoing. Exposure to the elements, hard physical labor, poor food, and constant danger from storms or pirates. Wealthy owners or chieftains might use thralls to assist in craft production. While the skilled blacksmith or carpenter would be a free person, thralls might perform the heavy, less skilled tasks. Working the bellows for the forge, incredibly hot, exhausting work, hauling wood or metal, hammering hot iron, risking burns, digging clay for pottery, preparing hides for leatherworking, a particularly foul-smelling and unpleasant process involving scraping and soaking skins. These specialized tasks often meant different sensory experiences compared to farm work. The intense heat and smoke of a forge or charcoal pit, the dust and darkness of a mine, the constant smell of chemicals used in leatherworking, the endless rhythm of the sea. But they shared the core characteristics of thrall labor. Physical demand, long hours, dangerous conditions, minimal compensation beyond bare subsistence, and constant subservience. While a skilled thrall might theoretically be slightly more valued and thus perhaps slightly less likely to be casually killed, they were still property. Their skills didn't grant them freedom, only potentially a different location and type of work. For a modern person, these jobs would be incredibly difficult, not just the physical effort, but the lack of safety equipment, the primitive tools, and the constant exposure to hazards. Your body and lungs, unaccustomed to such environments, would struggle immensely. It is a grim and uncomfortable truth that female thralls were frequently subjected to sexual exploitation by their owners' sons, or other free men on the farm or in the household. As property, a female thrall's body was not considered her own. She had no legal right to refuse, no recourse for protection, and no one she could appeal to. The sagas and law codes are often silent on the everyday realities of sexual violence against thralls, perhaps because it was so commonplace as to not be worth recording, or because the victims had no voice in the historical record. However, what evidence we do have, combined with the legal status of thralls as property, strongly suggests that female thralls were highly vulnerable. An owner might use a female thrall for his pleasure, perhaps temporarily, or she might become his sort of concubine, especially if his wife was absent, or if he sought to increase his stock of thralls, as children born to a thrall mother were also thralls regardless of the father's status. While some owners might have been less cruel than others, the fundamental power dynamic was absolute. Consent was not a concept that applied to a thrall. Imagine living with this constant threat. Your body is not your own. There is no safe space, no legal protection, no one to defend you. The very people who provide you with meager food and shelter are also those who can violate you with impunity. The psychological terror of this reality, day in and day out, is almost impossible for us to fully grasp from our modern perspective, where bodily autonomy is a fundamental right. Beyond the immediate horror of assault, this reality added another layer of powerlessness and degradation to a female thrall's life. Her existence was not just defined by her labor, but by her potential use and abuse by others. Any children she bore would be a constant reminder of her lack of control over her own body and fate, as they too would be born into slavery. This is perhaps the most profoundly disturbing aspect of thrall existence, and one that highlights the absolute dehumanization inherent in the system. For any person, regardless of gender, the knowledge that your body is not yours and can be used or violated at any moment by those in power would be an unbearable psychological burden. It's a reality that would strip away not just your freedom, but your sense of self-worth and safety, making survival a constant state of psychological as well as physical defense. Let's return to the sensory experience, specifically the unpleasant ones. Viking Age hygiene, even for free people, was vastly different from ours. For thralls, it was almost non-existent. As mentioned, you likely had one or two rough wool tunics and leg wraps. Wool is warm, but also itchy when coarse and dirty. These clothes would be worn constantly, day and night, until they were literally falling apart. Washing clothes was a rare event, probably only when they became so stiff with dirt or infested that it was unavoidable. Imagine wearing the same sweaty, stained, smelly clothes for weeks or months on end. Personal washing was also infrequent and basic. A dip in a cold stream or lake, perhaps. Maybe a splash of water from a bucket. There were no hot showers, no soap as we know it, though they had lye-based cleansers for wool, no clean towels. The idea of washing daily or even weekly for cleanliness was not part of the culture, especially for those whose labor left them perpetually dirty anyway. The result? A constant, pervasive smell of unwashed bodies, sweat, dirt, and stale clothing. Lice and fleas were a given. Imagine the constant, maddening itch. Running your fingers through your hair and feeling the telltale bumps of nits, or seeing fleas jumping on your clothes. There was no easy way to get rid of them. You simply lived with them. Sanitation in the longhouse and around the farm was primitive. Waste was disposed of outside, but smells lingered, attracting flies and other pests. Food scraps might be scattered. Animal waste in the byre was a constant source of stench and disease. This lack of hygiene had direct consequences for health. Skin infections, boils, and rashes would be common due to dirt, parasites, and lack of washing. Intestinal parasites were likely widespread from contaminated food and water. Combine this with the poor diet and relentless physical labor, and you have a recipe for constant, low-grade illness and vulnerability to serious disease. Minor cuts and scrapes from work could easily become infected without antiseptic or proper cleaning. A cold or flu would hit you hard with no medicine beyond herbal remedies, if any were offered to a thrall. More serious diseases like dysentery, tuberculosis, or pneumonia would be rampant in crowded, unsanitary conditions and would often be fatal. Imagine being constantly itchy, smelly, and feeling dirty while also battling various minor ailments and being highly susceptible to major ones. Your body, used to antibiotics, vaccines, pain relief, and generally clean environments, would be constantly assaulted by pathogens and discomfort. The feeling of being unable to get clean, to escape, the dirt and parasites would be a constant, low-grade misery, adding to the physical toll of your life. Your modern immune system, trained in a relatively sterile world, would be completely unprepared for this constant barrage. In a world without modern medicine, sanitation, or safety standards, life was precarious for everyone. For a thrall, it was exponentially more so. Sickness and injury weren't just uncomfortable setbacks, they were potentially fatal threats that were met with indifference, or worse, by your owners. As we discussed, the living conditions, diet, and hygiene meant you were constantly exposed to illness. Simple things we treat easily today could be deadly. A severe fever, persistent cough, or crippling stomach bug could quickly incapacitate you. Without medical attention or even basic nursing care, the Free family's focus would be on their own sick. You would be left to suffer. If you were too weak to work, you were useless property. Injuries were also frequent given the nature of the work. Handling heavy tools, working with animals, felling trees, mining, working near fire, all carried risks. A sprained ankle, a deep cut from an axe or sickle, a broken bone from a fall or being kicked by an animal. These injuries would be incredibly painful, would likely heal poorly or become infected, and there would be no time off to recover. You'd be expected to work through the pain if possible, or perhaps given lighter duties, but the injury would limit your usefulness and could easily lead to permanent disability or chronic pain. Imagine breaking an arm or leg, no ambulance, no hospital, no x-rays, no casts. Maybe your owner would try to set it roughly, or maybe they wouldn't bother much beyond bandaging it with whatever was available. The pain would be excruciating and constant. Healing would be slow and uncertain. The risk of infection in the bone would be high. And if you became permanently disabled or too old and frail to work, your value to your owner plummeted. While some owners might have felt a limited sense of responsibility, especially if you had served them well for many years, many might see you simply as a drain on resources. There was no social safety net. A disabled or elderly thrall might be given less food, neglected, or even, in the most brutal cases, simply abandoned or killed if they were no longer useful. The sagas contain grim accounts of thralls being killed by owners, sometimes for minor transgressions, sometimes out of rage, and sometimes simply because they were no longer productive. While law codes stipulated fines for killing a thrall, as it was destruction of property, this didn't prevent it from happening, and who would report it or enforce the law if the owner was powerful? The constant underlying fear of injury or illness, knowing that it could easily lead to excruciating pain, permanent disability, and potentially abandonment or death, would be a heavy psychological burden. Your body would be your only asset, and its failure meant disaster. For you, accustomed to a world where healthcare, even if not perfect, is a fundamental expectation, living with this level of vulnerability and the potential for utter neglect in the face of suffering would be terrifying. Your modern mind would likely struggle to accept such a bleak reality. The owner's authority over a thrall was nearly absolute. Disobedience, perceived laziness, mistakes, attempts to escape, or even just incurring the owner's displeasure could result in swift and often brutal punishment. There was no system of justice for you, no appeal, only the immediate and unchecked power of the person who owned you. Punishment could take many forms, ranging from verbal abuse and being deprived of already meager food rations to physical violence. Beatings with fists, sticks, or whips were common. The sagas sometimes describe owners beating thralls severely. Imagine the feeling of the blows, the sting of a whip cutting into your skin, the bruises, the pain that lingered long after the physical assault ended. More severe punishments could include being put in stocks or bonds, being branded, a permanent mark of ownership and status, or even mutilation, such as cutting off ears or hands as a warning to others or as retribution for theft or escape attempts. While extreme, these punishments were possible because you were property. Maiming a thrall was akin to damaging equipment, with the primary consequence being the reduction in the thrall's value rather than a crime against a person's body. The psychological impact of living under the constant threat of such arbitrary violence is immense. Your safety depends entirely on your owner's mood and disposition. There is no predictability, no set rules you can follow to guarantee your security. A bad harvest, a disagreement with his neighbor, or simply a foul temper could lead to you becoming the target of his frustration. Imagine the fear that would be a constant knot in your stomach. Every interaction with your owner or his family would be tinged with anxiety. You would learn to read their moods, to anticipate potential triggers for anger, to make yourself as invisible and inoffensive as possible. But even your best efforts might not be enough. You had no right to defend yourself against your owner. Any resistance would likely be met with even more severe punishment. Your only options were submission, trying to appease, or the incredibly risky choice of attempting escape. The feeling of being utterly defenseless, of having your physical safety contingent on the arbitrary whim of another person, would be a constant source of terror and stress. For a modern person used to laws that protect against assault and battery, and with avenues for reporting abuse, living under such unchecked power would be psychologically unbearable. The sheer, grinding fear would wear you down faster than any physical labor. We've touched on this already, but it bears repeating and exploring in more detail. The legal and social status of a thrall was profoundly different from that of a free person. This wasn't just about physical limitations, it was about a fundamental denial of your humanity in the eyes of society and the law. You were legally classified as movable property, laissez-faire, the same category as livestock, tools, or silver. This status meant you had no legal standing. You could not bring a lawsuit, you could not testify in court, or your testimony held little to no weight. You could not enter into contracts, you could not swear oaths. Your existence was recognized by the law primarily in relation to your owner's rights over you. Imagine being injured by a free person other than your owner. You couldn't sue them for damages. Your owner could, arguing that their property had been damaged and they would receive any compensation. Your pain and suffering were legally irrelevant. Only the economic loss to your owner mattered. You couldn't own property. Anything you acquired through luck, gift, or finding legally belonged to your owner. Even the clothes on your back were technically his. This meant you could not build wealth, could not save for a better future, could not acquire anything that might give you a small measure of independence or comfort. Family ties were not legally recognized. You couldn't legally marry without your owner's permission. If you did form a bond with another thrall or even a free person, which was rare and complex, that bond had no legal protection. Your children were not yours in the eyes of the law. They belonged to your owner from birth, inheriting your status. Your owner could separate you from your spouse or children at any time by selling one of you, and there would be nothing you could do about it. Imagine the emotional pain of this, forming connections, perhaps even finding love in the bleakness, only to know that those relationships were entirely at the mercy of someone else's decision. The constant anxiety of potential separation. Socially, you were an outcast. You would eat separately from the free family, use different tools or utensils, and your presence in certain social gatherings of free people might be unwelcome or forbidden. You might be referred to by demeaning terms. Your name might not even be used. You might be called by a nickname related to your origin or appearance, or simply referred to as the thrall. This constant, daily reminder of your lower-than-low status, the complete lack of respect or recognition of your inherent worth as a person, would be psychologically corrosive. You are not just poor or disadvantaged. You are legally and socially categorized as less than fully human. The feeling of being invisible, disregarded, and utterly powerless would be a crushing weight on your spirit. Your modern identity is built on concepts of individual rights, dignity, and self-worth. These concepts would be utterly absent from your life as a thrall. Beyond the physical hardships, the constant hunger, the cold, the pain, and the fear of violence, the emotional and psychological burden of being a thrall would be immense. For someone from the modern world, this might be the hardest part to bear. Imagine the crushing weight of hopelessness. There is no future to look forward to, only a continuation of the grim present. No career to build, no goals to strive for, no possibility of improving your life through hard work or talent. Your life is dictated by the needs and whims of your owner. This complete lack of agency, of control over your own destiny, is profoundly demoralizing. Boredom, punctuated by terror, would be a constant. The work is repetitive and monotonous. There are no books, no entertainment, no hobbies, no social life beyond brief, exhausted interactions with other thralls, if any were present. Hours upon hours of grinding grain, pulling an oar, or mucking out stalls. Your mind would be left with little to do but dwell on your misery, your loss, and your fear. Then there's the grief. If you were captured, you've lost everything. Your home, your family, your community, your past identity. You are in a foreign land surrounded by strangers who see you as property. The mourning for your lost life would be a constant, dull ah in your heart. The fear, as we've discussed, is omnipresent. Fear of punishment, fear of injury, fear of being sold away from the few people you might have connected with, fear of what tomorrow might bring. This constant state of hypervigilance and anxiety is incredibly draining and wears away at your mental resilience. The loss of identity is also profound. You are no longer John or Mary from such and such a village. You are simply the thrall, perhaps called by a foreign name given by your owner, or no name at all. Your past, your skills, unless useful to the owner, your family history, none of it matters. You are reduced to your current function and status. Isolation, even when surrounded by others, would be common. You are separated from the free family, treated differently. Other thralls might be temporary companions, but the knowledge that any of you could be sold at any moment makes deep bonds risky. Imagine trying to maintain your sense of self-worth in a world that constantly tells you you have none. Every interaction, every task, every glance would reinforce your status as property. The dehumanization is not just legal and social, it's a daily psychological assault. Depression, despair, and a complete loss of will would be almost inevitable outcomes for a modern person placed in this situation. We rely on hope, on control, on connection, on a sense of purpose to maintain our mental well-being. As a thrall, all of these would be systematically denied to you. Your mind, accustomed to a world of choices and opportunities, would likely break under the strain of utter powerlessness and hopelessness long before your body gave out. Was there any hope of escaping the thrall's life? Very rarely, yes, but the paths to freedom were few, difficult, and often led only to a slightly less precarious existence. The most formal way to gain freedom was through manumission. This was when an owner voluntarily freed a thrall. Why would they do this? Perhaps as a reward for exceptionally long and loyal service, particularly if the thrall was a skilled craftsman or had saved the owner's life or property. It might be specified in an owner's will upon their death, a final act of limited generosity or piety. Sometimes a thrall might be able to save up, if they were allowed to keep tiny amounts of money or goods from trading on their owner's behalf, which was rare, or be given a gift by a sympathetic person and use this to buy their freedom or at least contribute to buying it. The price of a thrall varied greatly based on age, health, skills, and origin, but it was a significant investment, likely beyond the means of a thrall to earn quickly or easily. Manumission was a public, legal act, often requiring witnesses. The freed thrall would then become a leisingi, a freedman or freedwoman. While free, their status was still lower than that of a freeborn person, bondi or carl. They often remained dependent on their former owner for patronage and protection. They might still owe duties or payments to their former master. Their children, however, would generally be born free after a generation or two, depending on the specific law code and time period. So, manumission offered freedom for the individual, but it was a freedom weighed down by past status and ongoing obligations. Another path was escape. This was incredibly risky. Where would you go? You would be a stranger in the land, easily identifiable by your lack of property, lack of connections, and likely foreign accent or appearance if you weren't from the immediate area. Owners had the right to recapture runaway thralls, and it was considered a duty for free people to assist in returning them. Getting caught meant severe punishment, likely branding or mutilation to make future escapes harder, or even death. Escaping might mean trying to reach a territory where Viking rule or slave systems were different, or where you might find protection, perhaps with distant relatives if you were captured, or in an area with a different political power like the Franks or Anglo-Saxons. But the journey would be perilous. You'd have no resources and you'd be constantly hunted. Rebellion was almost unheard of. Thralls were scattered, disarmed, closely watched, and often from diverse backgrounds, lacking common language or organization. Isolated acts of violence against owners did occur, sometimes recounted in sagas, but these were acts of desperate individuals seeking revenge, not coordinated uprisings. A large-scale thrall rebellion was practically impossible given the power structure and control mechanisms. So, while freedom was theoretically possible, it was statistically unlikely for the vast majority of thralls. Your daily existence would be shaped by the near certainty that you would die in the same state in which you lived, as someone's property. This faint possibility of freedom wouldn't be enough to sustain the average modern person through the daily grind of hopelessness and suffering. Knowing your chances were vanishingly small would make the reality of servitude even harder to bear. It's easy, when focusing on individual experience, to forget the sheer scale of slavery in the Viking Age. Thralls were not a marginal group. They were fundamental to the economy and society. Estimates vary among historians depending on the region and time period, but it's commonly suggested that thralls might have constituted anywhere from 10% to 30% of the population in core Viking areas like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. In newly conquered or settled territories like Iceland, Ireland, or parts of England, where raiding provided a fresh and constant supply of captives, the proportion could have been even higher, perhaps exceeding 50% in some areas during peak.
Raiding periods, imagine that. In a community of 100 people, 10, 20 or even 50 of them could be slaves. This wasn't a hidden shame, it was an open, accepted and vital part of the social order.
Thrall labour built houses, cleared land, tended crops, raised livestock, cooked food, wove cloth, and provided the surplus wealth that funded expeditions and supported the free population. The slave trade was a major driver of the Viking economy, alongside furs, timber, and other goods. Raiding was not just about silver and glory, it was fundamentally about acquiring human capital. The routes stretched across the known world, bringing captives from the British Isles, Francia, Iberia, Slavic lands, and the Baltic region into Scandinavia and its settlements, and then onward through trade networks to Byzantium and the Caliphates. Major markets like Dublin and Hedeby were processing centres for thousands of captives annually. Accounts from Arab travellers like Ibn Fadlan describe the Rus, Viking merchants in Eastern Europe, trading slaves on the Volga River markets. The sheer volume of human beings being bought and sold is staggering. This scale is important to understand. As a thrall, you wouldn't be an anomaly, you'd be part of a large, oppressed underclass. This shared experience might offer some small comfort in recognizing fellow sufferers, but it also meant the system was deeply entrenched and incredibly difficult to challenge. Your individual suffering was just one drop in an ocean of human misery that powered Viking society. Understanding the scale emphasizes just how integral slavery was. It wasn't just something they occasionally did, it was built into the very structure of their world. And it makes the idea of you a product of a society that abolished slavery centuries ago and champions human rights lasting even a single day within that massive, brutal system seem even more improbable. You would be just one face among millions, utterly insignificant to the powerful few who controlled your life and the lives of so many others. While the fundamental experience of being owned was universal, the specific realities of a thrall's life could vary somewhat depending on the region, the era, and the type of owner. In core Scandinavian areas, thralls were often integrated into the farmstead economy, as we've described. Their lives were centered around agricultural labor. In Iceland, which was settled primarily by Norwegians, many early settlers brought thralls with them, often captives from the British Isles. Thrall labor was crucial for clearing the land and establishing farms in the challenging environment. Icelandic sagas provide some of our most detailed, albeit often biased, accounts of thrall life, including stories of particularly harsh masters or rare instances of thralls saving up to buy their freedom. The isolation of Iceland might have meant slightly less exposure to large-scale international slave markets compared to major trading towns, but it also meant fewer places to escape to. In the Viking settlements in Britain and Ireland, like the Danelaw or the Norse kingdoms of Dublin, York, etc., thralls might be working not only on farms but also in nascent towns, involved in crafts, trade support, or domestic service for wealthy Viking lords. The interaction with the existing Anglo-Saxon or Gaelic populations, who also had forms of slavery, could create complex social dynamics. Captives here might have come from anywhere the Vikings raided, including deep into the British Isles or the continent. In the east, along the river routes of the Rus, thralls were not just used locally, but were a primary commodity for trade with the Byzantine Empire and the Caliphate. Captives from Slavic, Baltic, and Finnish peoples, among others, were marched along the river routes to markets like Kiev, where they were exchanged for silver and luxury goods. These thralls faced the added horror of being sold into entirely different cultures and often transported vast distances across land and sea, facing unknown fates. Their journey and ultimate destination might be even more terrifying than that of a thrall, sold within Scandinavia. Even within the same region, the experience could vary based on the owner. A thrall owned by a wealthy, powerful jarl might face different pressures and tasks, perhaps more specialized labor, participation in larger expeditions, or working in a more complex household compared to a thrall owned by a struggling small farmer whose need for labor might be more desperate, but resources for feeding, housing more limited. Some owners might have been relatively, and this is relative, less brutal than others, though the power imbalance always remained. These variations highlight that there wasn't one single thrall experience, but rather a spectrum of misery and hardship dictated by geography, economy, and the temperament of the individual owner. However, the core elements, loss of freedom, lack of rights, forced labor, poor conditions, and vulnerability to the owner's will, remained constant regardless of location or specific task. The specific flavor of your suffering might change, but the bitter taste of servitude would always be present. So let's bring it all together. We've explored the different facets of a thrall's life, the sudden, brutal loss of freedom, the terrifying journey into servitude, the dehumanizing experience of the slave market, the cramped, unsanitary, and uncomfortable living conditions, the constant hunger and monotonous, inadequate food, the relentless, back-breaking, and dangerous labor, whether in the fields, the household, or specialized tasks, the grim reality of sexual exploitation, the pervasive dirt, parasites, and lack of hygiene, the constant threat of illness and injury. Without care, the arbitrary and brutal nature of punishment, the legal and social status of being non-human property, and the crushing emotional and psychological weight of hopelessness, fear, and loss of identity. Now think about you, the modern person listening to this. You are accustomed to a level of comfort, safety, autonomy, and dignity that would be utterly alien to a Viking Age thrall. Your body is not conditioned for that level of continuous, brutal physical labor using inefficient tools. Your hands would be raw and blistered, your back and joints screaming, your muscles constantly aching. Your immune system is not prepared for the constant exposure to pathogens in crowded, unsanitary living conditions, dealing with poor food, parasites, and lack of hygiene. A simple infection or stomach bug that you'd shrug off with modern medicine could incapacitate or kill you. Your mind is not equipped to handle the crushing weight of hopelessness, the complete lack of control over your life, the constant fear of violence and punishment, and the dehumanization of being treated as property. We rely on agency, hope, and personal connection to survive. A thrall had almost none of these. Your expectations of food, sleep, privacy, and personal space would be constantly violated. The sensory assault of smell, dirt, cold, and discomfort would be a perpetual torment. Your fundamental understanding of your own worth, your rights, and your bodily autonomy would be shattered by the reality of being owned, displayed, and potentially abused at will. Even if you were physically strong and mentally resilient by modern standards, the combination of relentless physical demand, constant psychological stress, profound lack of hygiene, poor nutrition, exposure, and utter powerlessness would create an environment so hostile to your modern being that enduring it for even a single day with the full knowledge of what the rest of your life would hold would be an extraordinary, almost impossible feat. You might survive the initial capture. You might survive the journey. You might survive being sold. But facing the reality of a lifetime of dawn to dusk labor, constant hunger, sleeping on a dirt floor, being perpetually dirty and itchy, living under the threat of the whip, with no hope, no rights, and no escape. The sheer shock to your system, both physical and mental, would be overwhelming. Your body would break down, or your will to live in such conditions would simply evaporate. The gap between your modern reality and the Viking Age thralls' reality is not just centuries of technological and social change, it's a chasm in the very definition of human existence and what is considered bearable suffering. So, yes, when you picture the Vikings, remember the long ships, the warriors, the craftsmen, but also remember the thrall. The person whose silent, brutal labor propped up that society. The person who lived without freedom, rights, or hope. And understand that the gap between their world and yours is so vast, so fundamentally different, that you wouldn't last a day as a Viking slave. It's a stark, grim truth, but an essential one for truly understanding the Viking Age beyond the myths and legends. All right, take a deep breath. Let the weight of that historical reality settle. We've spent a significant amount of time exploring a life defined by absence. Absence of freedom, absence of rights, absence of comfort, absence of hope. It's a heavy topic, I know, but understanding the lives of those at the very bottom of society is just as crucial to understanding a historical period as studying the lives of kings and warriors. It paints a much fuller and often much grimmer picture. Thinking about the reality of Viking Age slavery, the thrall's existence, makes us appreciate, perhaps a little more keenly, the things we often take for granted today. Our freedom, our rights, our physical safety, our access to healthcare, the basic ability to make choices about our own lives, and the simple dignity of being recognized as a person, not property. It wasn't that long ago in the grand sweep of history that this level of human suffering was commonplace and legally sanctioned across many cultures, including this seemingly romantic period of the Vikings. What aspect of the thrall's life that we discussed today surprised you the most, or perhaps disturbed you the most? The sheer scale of the slave trade, the lack of hygiene, the legal status as property, the psychological toll? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Hearing your perspectives helps continue the conversation and deepen our understanding together. If you found this deep dive into a lesser-known historical reality valuable, please consider giving this video a thumbs up. It helps more people discover these hidden corners of history. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our future explorations into the past. Thank you for joining me on this journey today. It wasn't an easy one, but hopefully it was an illuminating one. Now, as the modern world calls you back, take a moment to appreciate the simple comforts around you. Sleep well.